Hi, I'm Kevin Dhuyvetter, Extension Agricultural Economist at Kansas State University, and this short video is to try to answer some questions that we frequently receive regarding cropland leases. One of the questions we often get is, what percentage of the crop should I receive in a crop share lease? We recognize that in many areas of the country, people are moving to more and more cash rents, but there's still a lot of crop share leases, especially here in Kansas, and with the recent volatility in crop prices, we might actually see a trend towards moving back towards more crop share. Well, the basic principle that we use to answer this question is the fact that we expect returns should be split proportionately to how inputs are contributed. So in that case, if I, as the landowner, contribute 40% of the expenses, I should get 40% of the income. And this is what we refer to as an equitable lease. Well, in order to find out what these percentages are, this requires us to build a budget for each crop that's grown on the land and then identify who provides each of the inputs, whether it's the landowner, whether it's a tenant, or whether it's shared. So this principle that says we'll split the income in the same way as we contribute the expenses, once again is referred to as an equitable crop share percentage. This is discussed in much more detail in the Crop Share Rental Arrangements for Your Farm publication, NCF MEC02, which is found on the Ag Lease 101 website. This also is covered in a spreadsheet that we have here at Kansas State University called KSU Lease. A number of universities have other decision tools that work to help you go through the process of identifying the inputs, basically the crop budgets, to decide what contributions are being provided by both parties. A second question we often get with regards to crop share leases is, well, which inputs should be shared? Should we share herbicides? Should we share fertilizer? Things of that nature. Our general recommendation would be that any inputs that follow what we would call a yield increasing type of relationship should be shared, as this promotes the optimal economic use of that input. Beyond that, it really is up to the landowner and tenant to simply negotiate which inputs they want to share. So we do have recommendations for some inputs. Other than that, it's strictly a negotiation between the landowner and tenant. However, a couple things to keep in mind. As we change which inputs are shared, this might change the relative risk. For example, if I'm providing fuel and there's a lot of variability in fuel prices, that changes the relative risk for me as opposed to the other party. But the other important point is that if the lease is to remain equitable, it doesn't really matter who pays the input so long as they're compensated. That's my general recommendation. Is I have no problem if a landowner pays or doesn't pay for specific inputs, but whoever pays it needs to make sure they're compensated. Once again, this is also discussed further in the publication that's found on the Ag Lease 101 website. Well, to try to take maybe a graphical view of those questions, the next two slides try to show this in a little different framework. So let's think of that first question where we said, how should we divide the crop or the income in a crop share lease? Really what we've got is we have tenant contributions, things like machinery, labor, maybe seed. We have landowner contributions. That's the blue box in this diagram. That's going to be things like land, possibly things like irrigation equipment, tiles, things of that nature. And then we've got some inputs that might be shared, and that's denoted in the yellow box. Well, if we add those three up, what the tenant pays for, what the landowner pays for, and then those inputs that are shared, that just simply represents the total cost of producing a crop or a crop rotation. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the relative contributions of the tenant and the landowner of the non-shared costs. So in this very simplistic example, we're going to add up what's in the green box and the blue box and look at the shares of those, and then we're going to apply those same shares to the shared inputs, or in this case, the yellow box. So in this very simplified example, the tenant's contributions of the non-shared costs was 63.5%, the landowner's was 37.5%, and therefore we'd use those same percentages to share the inputs as well as the crop. Notice we do not start off with a predetermined idea as to how we should share the crop. Rather, do we let how we're contributing the inputs dictate how we would share the crop and any shared expenses. Well, that next question talked about which input should we share, In this simple little graph, we're showing something that's a yield increasing input. So let's think of something like how yield might respond to nitrogen fertilizer. So on the y-axis we have yield, on the x-axis we have fertilizer or nitrogen. And we can see that as I put more and more fertilizer on, yields go up, and at some point it levels off. Well, what decides the optimal level of input to use is the relative price ratios of the input, nitrogen in this case, versus the output, corn in this example. And we can see that the optimal level of fertilizer to apply is something less than what it would take to maximize yields. In other words, the economic optimal yield is typically going to be less than the maximum yield possible. You can see that if we change the slope of that green line, i.e. we change the price ratio, that will dictate whether we should put on more or less nitrogen, or X in this case. So if we don't share the input, the tenant would have all of the nitrogen cost. They would actually have an incentive to put on less fertilizer. So the reason we want to share inputs that follow this kind of relationship is it gives both parties the optimal signal, or the signal to apply the optimal amount of that input. Just as a final reminder, this information is discussed in much more detail in the Crop Share Rental Arrangements publication found on the Ag Lease 101 website. And with that, good luck with your crop share arrangements.